Hey there, welcome back to the channel, and a huge thanks for the feedback on my last video regarding amp sims using the Ed-S technique. I saw a bunch of you guys being active in the comments, which allowed me to read a bunch of the cool conversations that were going on, and I ended up learning a lot. However, it was pretty clear that some misconceptions started to arise, or some concerns and as well as criticisms regarding that technique. So I'm gonna dive into a couple of those right now and see if I can clear some of those up for you guys. Let's dive in. A quick heads up before we start. I am in no way saying that this is the only way to work with amp sims. I am simply sharing a technique that allows you to get a much more accurate response to your amp sims. It's not about one being right or wrong or one that's better or the other. It's simply an extra option that you guys have if you guys are seeking, like myself, a spot-on recreation in the digital format. Now, there's a few things here that I have to cover so that you guys have an idea as to why this technique is ultimately needed to get the most accurate response regarding our amp sims. And this has to do with the preamps on most budget interfaces. Now, the majority of us are running on budget interfaces. However, a lot of the times with these guys, because they're budget interfaces, the manufacturers don't put the best things that they can within those preamps, and they can cause distortion and saturation in a negative way, as well as reduced dynamic range. And while it may not sound like it's being affected in some way, those budget preamps do impart a little something on the DI tracks. Now, budget interfaces, while great for getting started, may not offer the cleanest gain, ultimately affecting how your guitar tone is processed regarding the DI track. This is where Ed-S's gain staging technique actually really shines, to manage the clipping and distortion that we may get from the reduced dynamic range that these budget interfaces have on their preamps. Now, I don't think it's as useful on higher end preamps and interfaces, although I still think that there is some value to the technique. Although your mileage may vary regarding the quality of the preamps that are present, the effect may be a little bit more subtle than it would be on like a really cheap Focusrite or a Behringer, for example. Either way, the correct gain staging for using budget interfaces with amp sims is really the crux of it all when trying to get accurate responses out of your amp sims. Which brings me to my second point here, which is the assertion that if the preamp is clean enough, adjusting the gain on the preamp, or using a trim plugin after the preamp, or adjusting the trim input knob on your amp sims makes no difference between the three options. But again, as I briefly discussed, that ultimately depends on the quality of the preamp. While it's true high quality preamps can provide extremely clean gain, and most budget interfaces are far above what we had before back in the early 2000s and in the late 90s. One of the criticisms I had in my previous video was that I compared gaining the preamp on your interfaces akin to using a pseudo tube screamer before your amp sims. Analog hardware, including preamps, interact with your guitar signal and the rest of the signal chain, adding harmonic content and sometimes even reducing dynamic range, affecting the signal beyond just simple amplification. Now, we need to remove this extra stage or layer in the signal chain by reducing the gain on our preamps as much as possible. This allows us to replicate basically the real world, where in the real world, all you would have is just your guitar, a cable, maybe a couple pedal boards, and then it goes straight into your amplifier. There is no intermediary gain stage of your guitar, cable, a preamp, then your pedals, which are optional, and then your amplifier. So again, by turning down the gain on the preamp, we're simulating the actual signal chain that would be present in the real world. Which leads me to my final third point, more or less. What's ultimately the difference between turning it down 0 on the preamp or turning it down on the input on your amp sim? You know, someone commented that it really doesn't make a difference because you're basically doing the same thing. It's either 0 on the preamp or 0 on your amp sims. Well, it's not as straightforward as choosing either one of the two options, because lowering the input gain on your plugin is not really the same thing as lowering the input gain on your preamp. Again, to my previous point, analog hardware imprint, regardless of what we can do about it, some kind of fingerprint on the source tone that is being captured. And to reiterate, most budget interfaces unfortunately do add some distortion, and they tend to clip even all the way down at 0 on the preamp. So the goal here is to match the level of your guitar to what the plugin expects after removing the preamp gain stage, and then readjusting with the input gain on your amp sim, ensuring the truest to life tones that are possible with the software. So I hope that kind of makes sense for you guys. Ultimately, it comes down to that budget interfaces, unfortunately, as well as they are built nowadays, do have an issue where even on the preamp gain all the way down, they still impart some form of harmonic content, aka distortion, as well as some clipping, even though it may not be apparent on your meters. So I suggest that you guys try this out for yourselves before coming to any conclusions. I have an interface that has essentially mastering grade preamps. So for me, it was a difference, but not the biggest difference, which you can see in another video that I made. And, you know, I mentioned in that video that it may not be worth it, but that's because I realized after reading the technical specifications on my interface that I have mastering grade preamps. A lot of us don't have that. My interface was quite expensive when I purchased it. Nevertheless, I suggest again, you guys try it, give it a shot. I hope this kind of clears up a little bit of the confusion as to why this technique may be needed, especially on budget interfaces. I'm sure that I'll get some very passionate comments in the comment section. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this bit of a clarification, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.